In a world where conflicts are no longer solely the domain of nation-states, private military companies have emerged as enigmatic players in the theater of war, offering their military expertise and services to the highest bidder. Among these clandestine warriors, one company stands out as the trailblazer, the blueprint for modern-day PMCs. This company would come to be known as Executive Outcomes. Born from the ashes of the South African military, this audacious group of battle-hardened soldiers rewrote the rules of engagement. Executive Outcomes showcased an unprecedented effectiveness in achieving its military objectives. Their story is one of high-stakes operations, disputed ethics, and a legacy that continues to shape the intriguing world of private military companies. Prepare to delve into the gripping tale of Executive Outcomes. The story of Executive Outcomes begins with that of ex-SADF Lieutenant Colonel Eben Barlow. In 1989, Eben Barlow would create Executive Outcomes, based out of Pretoria, South Africa, in its mission to provide specialized training services to Special Forces members. Executive Outcomes were to provide training to South African Special Forces, but this would come to an end by 1989. By 1989, South Africa had ended its long involvement in the conflicts in Angola and Namibia. As the Cold War was coming to an end, militaries all around the world would begin downsizing operations and manpower. At the same time in South Africa, massive political change was underway, as the years of apartheid drew to its ultimate end. As the negotiations between South African President P.W. Botha and Nelson Mandela were underway for the future of South Africa into the early 1990s, an agreement was struck between the two parties to dismantle key units within the South African military. Key units in the military, such as Eben Barlow's former unit, the Elite Light Infantry, 32 Battalion, as well as Kufut, South Africa's main counter-insurgency unit, and the Rekkies, South Africa's Special Forces Brigade. This decision would leave thousands of many battle-hardened soldiers with no work and their pension seemingly destroyed too as a result. No longer would Executive Outcomes provide specialized training to the South African military, but they would too profit on the dismantling of those key military units. Many soldiers in these dismantled units would be close associates of Executive Outcomes founder Eben Barlow. This would prove to be the perfect recruitment ground for Executive Outcomes. Many South African veterans would struggle to adjust to civilian life, with the only skills they have being fighting in conflicts. Eben Barlow and Executive Outcomes would provide an opportunity for many of these men from bankruptcy and financial ruin. Executive Outcomes would provide a well-paid salary from $2,000 to $3,000 a month for ground personnel and upwards of $7,000 for helicopter and jet fighter pilots, making them the highest paid soldiers in any other government in Africa. Executive Outcomes would not only recruit from former apartheid regime soldiers, but also from all South African citizens, including of its former apartheid regime rivals in Mkontwe Sizwe, the ANC's armed wing, and from the Azanian People's Army. The requirements to join EO was to be a South African citizen, have military or police training, be honorably discharged, and have no criminal record, and ultimately be prepared to work in high-risk environments. Race and religion would not influence the selection process. The company's motto, "Fit in or f off," would back this statement. Executive Outcomes would come to have more than 2,000 soldiers in their company, ready to fight and deploy at a moment's notice. Executive Outcomes would be a highly equipped force in their field of operations, consisting of their own helicopters, BMPs, transport aircraft, and even MiG jet fighters. EO's ranks would increase as they would now consist of a high number of highly trained and experienced soldiers accustomed to years of fighting in the African bushes of Angola, Namibia, and Mozambique. One of EO's first contracts outside of South Africa was in 1991. The first non-South African contract entailed the training of mine security officials for De Beers Mining Company in the neighboring African states of Namibia and Botswana in infiltration and penetration techniques targeted at organized crime syndicates. EO would gradually shift away from not only providing military training, but also providing personal classified missions. And they would not have to wait long to prove to the world their sheer effectiveness on the battlefield and surprise everyone with their overwhelming success. In 1992, UNITA rebels, under the leadership of the charismatic Jonas Savimbi, would denounce the recent Angolan elections, where the rival MPLA, under the leadership of José Eduardo dos Santos, would win the election. Not accepting these election results, UNITA would break the ceasefire agreement by restarting the already 17-year-long civil war, plunging Angola into chaos once more. UNITA would take over the country. By January of 1993, UNITA would advance rapidly throughout Angola, eventually capturing the key coastal port and oil city of Soyo, cutting off the MPLA's main source of income through oil. UNITA would eventually capture Soyo, halting international investment, which had just recently come into Angola. When Heritage Oil and Gas, a company owned by two British businessmen, Tony Buckingham and Simon Mann, when their oil operation in Angola was seized by UNITA in Soyo, the company would come up with a proposition and a solution posed to the Angolan government in order to recapture Soyo. The idea was to employ the use of mercenaries backed up by a brigade of Angolan forces to retake the city. After consideration, the plan was accepted by the Angolan government. Tony Buckingham and Simon Mann would proceed to contact the relatively unknown South African PMC, this being Executive Outcomes. The stage was set. For the South African mercenaries, some would feel an element of confliction as they would take on their old allies in UNITA, who the South African apartheid government had backed. Nevertheless, on February 16, 1993, 60 South African mercenaries would land north of Soyo. 1,300 Angolan troops would back them up against that of 3,000 UNITA rebels held out in the city. The fighting would be fierce. All former sympathies between these former allies would quickly disappear. After 6 weeks, Executive Outcomes and the Angolan government troops would push back UNITA from Soyo and recapture its oil fields. UNITA would be defeated with high casualties. Executive Outcomes would lose 3 men in the operation. EO would surprise many with their superior tactics, logistics, and air capabilities, which would overturn a much larger enemy force. Executive Outcomes had begun to shape its reputation as an effective fighting force. After their success on the battlefield, the Angolan government would come to ask Executive Outcomes to train and modify their battlefield doctrine to assist the Angolan troops to take back the rest of the country, of which 70% was in the control of UNITA rebels. EO would accept the Angolan government's approach. They would be tasked to take over the diamond fields from the UNITA rebels, which had been supplying much of their war effort. In total, the Angolan government would come to pay Executive Outcomes $80 million over 2 contracts to take on UNITA's forces. This $80 million at the time was said to be the best money the Angolan government had ever spent. By 1994, Executive Outcomes and the Angolan troops would have taken back 60% of the country. The much smaller force of Executive Outcomes would bring UNITA to the negotiation tables. Executive Outcomes' superior tactics and superior military hardware would capture all the diamond mines under UNITA control. UNITA had come to be so cautious of executive outcomes that in the peace agreement signed, it was said that all mercenaries had to leave Angola. Executive outcomes accolades in Angola had begun to garner attention from around the world. Having not deployed more than 800 EO personnel in the Angolan operation, a UN peacekeeping force would eventually replace all outgoing mercenaries. But only a few months later, UNITA would resume the war, and the country would be in turmoil and conflict up until 2002. EO's recent success in Angola had brought the world of mercenaries to the public eye once again, as their achievements began to be heard around the world. Allegations and critics from the media would come to surface as well. Tony Buckingham and Simon Mann would become senior associates with executive outcomes throughout the rest of their journey in Africa and around the world. EO would be followed by controversy, allegations and concern, as Buckingham and Mann's companies would come to profit greatly off the resources in areas in which EO had operated within. Critics and the media would begin accusing this as being predatory capitalism by specializing in the extraction of mineral and oil resources from troubled and failed states. For EO, their next major operation would come soon after in the nation of Sierra Leone. By 1995, Sierra Leone had been in a civil war for 4 years. The Revolutionary United Front, or RUF, with support from the nation of Liberia in exchange for diamonds, would attempt to take over the Sierra Leone government, led by the youngest leader of any nation at the time, 25-year-old Valentine Strasser, the head of the Sierra Leone military, who himself had come to power through a coup. Valentine Strasser's government at the time would proceed to contact EO after hearing of their recent success in Angola. The rival RUF had captured 2/3 of the country and its lucrative diamond fields to fund their military operation. The RUF consisted of many child soldiers and men from Liberia, taken from refugee camps and promised food and medicine in order to fight. The RUF would at first have public support against the lackluster and corrupt Sierra Leonean government. But soon, word would spread as RUF soldiers committed mass atrocities throughout Sierra Leone, hacking off limbs and murdering innocent civilians in their way. Although Sierra Leone's economy was in shambles, by early 1995, the RUF were located within 20 kilometers from the capital of Freetown. A deal would be struck with EO for a contract worth $1.8 million a month, as well as EO associates Tony Buckingham and Simon Mann having control over a lucrative kimberlite diamond mine. In March of 1995, EO would arrive in Sierra Leone, tasked with taking back control of the country from the RUF and capturing the diamond mines. EO would first begin their operations by training the local militias in favor of training the government troops, as they had become ill-disciplined, unreliable, and it too started to torment their own population, losing trust in the eye of many. As in Angola, executive outcomes would wipe the floor against all RUF resistance, the RUF being better suited to torturing innocent civilians than putting up an actual fight. EO would be welcomed by civilians as heroes and saviors of the people. They would eventually push back the RUF resistance, taking all diamond mines and cutting off their main center of operations. The RUF would concede in defeat. Outgunned and maneuvered, they would sign for peace in a peace deal that would hold an eventual free election. This was signed on the 30th of November, 1996. As in the Angolan peace agreement, and now under even more pressure from the United Nations, executive outcomes would be ordered to leave Sierra Leone and to eventually be replaced by a UN peacekeeping force. The international community and the United Nations would become concerned at the private sector's newfound ability to be so influential on a battlefield and subsequently shape politics. Originally, Executive Outcomes was ordered to leave immediately after the peace accord was signed, but they would urge that this decision would prove costly, as the RUF would immediately restart their war once their presence was removed. However, due to the IMF, who had been funding the Sierra Leonean government, wanted to shut up shop and end the mercenaries contract and cut its costs, EO would leave in January of 1997 and end all operations in Sierra Leone. The UN peacekeeping force was still yet to fully arrive in Sierra Leone. The RUF, as expected, had seized the opportunity and restarted their campaign and the civil war. Of the eventual 17,000 strong UN peacekeeping force that was to arrive and replace Executive Outcomes, they would prove to be insufficient in maintaining the peace and controlling the RUF. The United Nations would also come to be ineffective in the protection of civilians, who would once more be the subject to the RUF's atrocities. The United Nations would be seen as ineffective and expensive. In total, it would cost $1 billion per year to deploy UN Blue Helmets to do a job Executive Outcomes did with overwhelming success for just $30 million a year in comparison, and with the maximum of only 200 EO personnel deployed in the Sierra Leone operation. Despite EO's departure from Sierra Leone, a few mercenaries would remain and provide much of the fight in stopping the RUF rebel advances until the conflict's eventual end in 2002. EO's rampant success at bringing an end to a second war in Africa in record time. The media would continue to highlight and persecute the negative imagery associated with that of a mercenary. EO would not consider all the increasing media attention and what the outcome of this heightened international pressure would come to. Executive Outcomes days were seemingly numbered. Later on, in 1997, Executive Outcomes would find themselves again contacted for work, this time subcontracted by a British-based mercenary company, Sandline International, for work from another foreign government in need of their services, this time in Papua New Guinea, where the government forces would be at war against the inhabitants of Bougainville, fought by the Bougainville Revolutionary Army, an island in Papua New Guinea who would attempt to break away from the state and form its own independence in a war fought since 1988. Papua New Guinean troops would fail to take over the island and crush the rebellion. The island itself home to the richest copper mine in the world, the Panguna copper mine. The mine had been shut since the start of the war, with the Bougainville natives claiming the mine as only harming their environment and not economically benefiting the locals. The Papua New Guinean Prime Minister, Julius Chan, was looking for a quick solution to the conflict and would turn to Sandline International, owned by Tim Spicer and Simon Mann. Sandline International would first quote the Papua New Guinean government for $36 million to pull off the operation and take back the mine. Julius Chan and his government saw this as too expensive and would proceed to attempt to take back the island alone with its own military. This would have dire consequences. In a matter of 6 days, government forces would be decimated and forced into a full retreat off the island of Bougainville. After this disastrous failure, Julius Chan would change his mind and decide to pursue the contract, looking for a quick fix and an end to the conflict. Without approval from the Papua New Guinea Parliament and opposition from military advisors, who were later persuaded to get on board with the plans, Sandline would then subcontract Executive Outcomes for 31 of their personnel to come and train Papua New Guinean troops. Simon Mann and Tim Spicer had also negotiated with the government that if their military operation on Bougainville was a success, that they would too be able to buy out the Panguna copper mine, amassing enormous potential wealth. Executive outcomes would arrive in Papua New Guinea on the 7th of February 1997, but they would not be there as long as they expected. The controversial deal with Sandline International would soon come to the surface with great outcry. Alexander Downer, an Australian foreign minister, would hear of the plans to use mercenaries and leak the deal to the Australian press. The plans would receive great backlash worldwide. Tim Spicer would be arrested for his involvement in the deal. The deal with Sandline International and Executive Outcomes was argued to be illegal and undermine the sovereignty of Papua New Guinea. Jerry Singarok, senior military commander, would order all Executive Outcomes troops to immediately depart from the country and end all operations in Papua New Guinea. Tensions in the country itself would begin to arise as well. Julius Chan would be ordered to step down. Military personnel and protesters would soon surround the Parliament building in protest, nearly causing a full-blown coup to erupt. The involvement of Executive Outcomes in the controversial Sandline deal in Papua New Guinea would come to appear to be the final nail in the coffin for Executive Outcomes. With all the heightened media attention, it would prove to be difficult for Executive Outcomes to operate and be useful as they once were. Media scrutiny and public outcry would continue upon Executive Outcomes. Eben Barlow, EO's founder, would feel the pressure as well. Tired of defending himself and his company's operations from the media, later he would become the target of assassination attempts, and he would decide to eventually leave the company a few months later in July of 1997. The South African government would too feel the pressure from the international community to put an end to Executive Outcomes in some way. In 1998, the regulation of the Foreign Military Assistance Act would come into place. This new legislation prohibited unauthorized foreign military assistance. The law also would aim to prevent the South African government being involved and drawn into conflicts not of national interest. Although Executive Outcomes had a license to operate with the South African government prior to this act being enabled, the international scrutiny had effectively ended Executive Outcomes, who could no longer operate discreetly without amassing mass media attention. With its founder moving on in other financial ventures, the decision would be taken to close its doors. EO would be dissolved on the 31st of December 1998. EO, through its success, would bring back the term mercenary in the public debate. Despite their controversy, Executive Outcomes would routinely bring peace to their regions of operation, even if it was just temporary. Eben Barlow believes major foreign players have interests in these wars continuing in order to profit off these select nations' resources through destabilization. Other private military companies who would come to emerge in the wake of EO's absence and gain prominence and subsequent notoriety, like Blackwater and later Wagner, would come to use Executive Outcomes as the model and blueprint for modern-day PMCs. Eben Barlow would later re-enter the world of PMCs, becoming chairman of STEP International in 2009. STEP would be involved in providing military training to the Nigerian government against Boko Haram in 2015. Eventually, in 2020, Eben Barlow would leave STEP and, to the surprise of many, would re-establish Executive Outcomes. Eben said he had been approached by various different African governments to restart Executive Outcomes, realizing that the old method of peacekeeping had not been effective at all. Eben believes that Africans such as himself have to come together and solve African problems. Since EO's re-establishment in 2020, they seem to have learnt from their first run, keeping their recent operations discreet and secretive, as there is not much information on their recent assignments. Today in Africa, Executive Outcomes faces a much different playing field than the one they left, and in an industry in which they helped create and professionalize. Wagner and Chinese PMCs have recently had their hand in Africa, with various success. Can executive outcomes succeed once more, considering its disrupted past? With Africa stuck in ever-ending turmoil, can executive outcomes return to form as a highly effective fighting force? Only time will tell.